So what I want to share today is some ideas about how we might make sense of the new right. And by the new right, I mean the post-Trump right. I've been obsessed, probably like many of you, since Election Day with trying to, make sense of what is happening in the country politically. And I found integral to be very helpful in making sense of that. I titled this presentation The Old New Right, because I think most of what we're seeing is not new. It's old stuff. It's old stories. It's old narratives. It's old worldviews. And I think the key to understanding the future of the right and the future of American politics is the past. Not just the past of American history, but the deep past of human history, of the ancient forms of sense-making that are at play here, many of which are getting reactivated and deployed at scale. And I think what we're seeing is the collision of these old forms of sense-making, of consciousness and culture, with new life conditions, particularly the internet and social media, and what you might call late-stage neoliberal capitalism. So I want to do three things. First, I want to talk a little bit about the old right, what it is, and why it's largely kaput. Second is give you a kind of flyover terrain of the new right and all the new tribes and camps popping up in this strange new world. And third is offer some conclusions and directives about what an integral conservatism might look like and what I think has to happen for it to emerge. So let's dive in. So I'm going to be referencing the spiral dynamics colors, the traditional colors. I'm assuming most of you at least have a passing familiarity with this, so I won't really go into those in detail. I'll say a little bit, when appropriate, to flesh out the different colors, but I imagine most of you are pretty on board with all that. So let's start in the year 2000. On the left side of the screen, this is my kind of gloss on what the political culture looked like around that time. We might disagree at the margins, but that's, I think, a rough shot of what it looks like. The most conspicuous feature here is it's largely orange. You got a little bit of green, solid blue, a touch of red. And these are the parties. The political parties, the Republicans in red are largely orange to blue. The Democrats, largely orange to green. But the most important part here is that both parties have a really firm foot in orange, in modern liberalism, free market economics, right? The rule of law, civil liberties, civil rights, all those, that kind of package of ideas and institutions and practices that we call liberalism, liberal democracy. And over on the right side of the screen is my gloss on where we're at now in 2024. Huge expansion of green, shrinkage of orange, but most conspicuously is a monstrous flaring of red. And that's going to be something I'll reference quite a bit throughout the talk tonight, as I think this is really the skeleton key to understanding why things are going so haywire, is that red has been let into the political discourse and culture in a way that it has never been. And that's what's creating a lot of the jankiness and weirdness and gridlock and frustration of the culture. So I'll come back to that in a little bit. But first, liberalism. What is liberalism? This is what our civilization is arguably supposed to be based around, and it's a container, an orange container, which says purple magic and red ego, power, and blue traditionalism all get to flex and flow and do their thing in the private sector, in the private sphere. What they can't do is put their hands on the machinery of government and let those energies and those values and those ideas dictate everyone's lives. And I think a lot of what's happened is, in a way, the breaching of the solidity and the integrity of this container. And these primal energies have sort of spilled out and swamped into the public sphere and have begun to really erode the distinction between public and private and political and non-political. This is one of the reasons, as we're noticing, that it seems like everything has been politicized. So what's the old right? So the old right, I largely take it to be what's sometimes called fusionism, the more or less stable integration of orange and green, of orange modernity, free market economics, classical liberal political philosophy, and blue traditional institutions, family values, largely but not exclusively drawing from the Christian tradition. Right, this was the old right, largely associated with the Reagan years, and conservatives would typically identify it as a stool with three legs. One was economic, so free markets, leading to more economic freedom, more prosperity, more peace. Small government, so the libertarian wing. Foreign policy, a muscular interventionist foreign policy. This was largely forged in the crucible of the Cold War and anti-communism. Of course, after the collapse of the Cold War, it morphed into neoconservatism, which became more about the promotion of democracy, if not the imposition of democracy around the world. And the third was cultural, social conservatism, family values, traditional marriage, these kinds of things we're all familiar with. So what led to the collapse of the old right? There's a few things that I identify. The first is the Great Recession of 2008. I think this was seen as a real death knell. The populisms that have been roiling not just the US, but the Western world for the last 15 years, I think can largely be traced to 2008 and a discrediting of Wall Street and casino capitalism and the financialization of the economy and greater concern about economic inequality that wasn't there before, or not, at least not as much. The second is the war in Iraq, and this kicked out the stool of the traditional foreign policy views of the GOP, very hawkish, very internationalist, largely discredited the neoconservative project and gave way to more of an isolationist mentality that we're seeing with Trump especially. The third event is a relatively minor one relative to those two, and it's the selection of Sarah Palin as John McCain's running mate. Because what that did was it shifted the norms around what was considered possible and permissible in political discourse, especially who's qualified to run and who's qualified to be president. And that dovetailed with a series of events. One was the Tea Party movement in 2010, which was an AstroTurf movement. That is, it was made to appear grassroots, but it was funded by deep pockets among libertarians, particularly the Koch brothers, pushing back against so-called big government through Obamacare, the bank bailouts, the auto bailouts, the stimulus package, the Keynesian response to the Great Recession. The third was birtherism. I think we forget that Trump's entrance into American politics, modern entrance, was through the lie that Obama was not born in the United States. And this evoked a nativist sentiment that was an early seed of what became Trumpism. And the last was the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015. I think it may be difficult for folks who are not installed in conservative religious cultures to appreciate how destabilizing this felt. And actually, there's new data suggesting that support for same-sex marriage is starting to decline. The religious right really saw this as an alarming attack on their way of life. And I think some of what we're seeing now can be traced back to that. So that's a very short story, but that's my going narrative for what the old right is and what happened to it. So let's shift gears to the new right. So what I want to do now is give you a kind of warp speed overview of the new tribes on the right. This is not an exhaustive list, believe it or not, but there's a lot of tribes I'm going to sample. I should say that these different groups overlap a great deal with each other. They're difficult to disentangle, but these are, to use Ken Wilber's phrase, orienting generalizations to help try and clarify our vision. So let's start at the bottom with QAnon and the QAnon shaman. I take this to be a largely purple kind of vibe, magic, and it's the place of conspiracy theories. But before I go into any detail about QAnon, I want to say that I think part of what's weird about our situation right now is that we're all kind of becoming conspiracy theorists. It's happening on the left and the right. And why do people resort to this? Well, I think it's a kind of associative thinking. It's like in dreams. Things kind of flow into each other, and the infrastructure of the internet selects for that way of thinking. Things are kind of mashed up and mushed together, and you make connections that aren't there in a desperate kind of plea for cognitive coherence. So I see this as a very extreme form of a condition that all of us are, to some extent, swimming in. Earlier forms, you might, if anybody remembers Glenn Beck on his chalkboard on Fox News, making all these connections, I think that's kind of in this neighborhood. So paranoid, Richard Hofstadter talked about the paranoid style in American politics. Magical thinking, dark forces pulling the strings, a satanic cannibalistic cult drinking the blood of children running the world, and so on. And I want to read a couple of selections from some recent Atlantic articles that really mainline this mentality. The first is from an article about second-generation Trumpers. So this is children who grew up in Trump households. So this is a child and his grandmother talking. I remember when he was elected, I just liked him, Jordan said, recalling how his mother felt similarly. I just knew he was better than Hillary. I couldn't tell you how. You're a smart kid, his grandmother said. Don't forget about the evil versus good. Good versus evil, Jordan repeated, looking at her. I know about satanic stuff most Democrats are into. Republicans talk about worshiping Jesus Christ, and Democrats worship the government. We listen to a lot of prophets, and we understand Bohemian Grove, his grandmother said, referring to some bleak corner of the Q-Anon conspiracy. FYI, for those who don't know, Bohemian Grove, just Google it, look into it, interesting stuff. The second is a profile that George Packer just did of the QAnon shaman, Jacob Chansley. It was in this month's Atlantic. Chansley is running for Congress, apparently. So Packer writes, I'm quoting him here, why had he gone to the Capitol in regalia on January 6th? He had a spiritual answer and a political answer. The Earth's electromagnetic field produces ley lines, he explained, which crisscross one another at sacred sites of civilizational importance, such as temples, pyramids, and the buildings on the National Mall. If there's going to be 1 million people assembling on the ley lines in Washington, it's my shamanic duty, I believe, to be there, and to ensure that the highest possible frequencies of love and peace and harmony are plugged into the ley lines. That was the spiritual answer. The political answer consisted of a long string of government abuses and cover-ups going back to the Tuskegee experiment and continuing through the Warren Commission, Waco, Oklahoma City, 9/11, Iraq, Afghanistan, Hillary Clinton's emails, COVID and the lockdowns, Hunter Biden's laptop, and finally the stolen 2020 election. Now, there's a sort of equation that I hadn't heard until Carter mentioned it at the ICON conference, but I immediately clicked into, which was that green allows purple. Green sort of attacks orange and dissolves blue and allows this kind of purple energy to kind of come up and play. And I think there's something going on here with the media ecosystem we're swimming in. Francis Fukuyama, the political scientist, just published an article called "It's the Internet, Stupid." Around the turn of the century, we thought that the internet was going to make everybody orange. It was going to democratize information and connect everybody and help them kind of grow out of their, more parochial identities. Didn't happen. Instead, you might say it's made us all more purple and more red. Green is now baked into, you might say, the media infrastructure. This was a really powerful idea that I first got from Rob Smith from Integral Life. It's built into the lower right quadrant, this flattening of the media ecosystem, so that we don't have credentialed elites. Merit doesn't decide who gets to speak and spread information. Anybody does. I think Jonathan Haidt coined a phrase for this called structural stupidity. So politics may be downstream from culture, but culture in some ways is downstream from economics in a broader sense of the term, not just the exchange of goods and services and money, but of ideas and information. Okay, moving on, up the spiral. Bronze Age pervert. This is another figure who has gotten some attention in the culture of late. So who is this guy? This is the alias of a writer named Costin Alamario. Not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. So he is a self-described fascist, racist bodybuilder who fetishizes ancient Greek culture and sort of the values and worldview of the Iliad and the Bronze Age. Also from The Atlantic, a recent cover story, they write, quote, "He argues that the natural and desirable condition of life is the domination of the weak and ugly by the strong and noble. He considers American cities a wasteland run by Jews and black people, though the words he uses to denote these groups are considerably less genteel than these. He's anti-democratic. He writes, I believe that democracy is the final cause of all the political problems I describe. He's anti-feminist. He writes, quote, it took 100 years of women in public life for them to almost totally destroy a civilization. He's anti-egalitarian, eugenicist. We should breed tall, strong, muscular, blonde, white men with, you get the point. So this is the virtues of the Iliad. The world is made of predators and prey, and so on. This is his book, Bronze Age Mindset. That's him on the left from his Twitter handle. His book is required reading for many young right-wingers. Some of you may remember that before Meatball Ron DeSanctimonious flamed out in the primaries, one of his staffers named Nate Hochman was fired for a viral video that went around that contained a Nazi symbol. According to Hochman, every junior staffer in the Trump administration has read Bronze Age Mindset. Moving on, Barstool Conservatives. So this name comes from the Barstool Sports Media Company, founded by Dave Portnoy. When Trump talked about locker room talk in the debate with Hillary Clinton in 2016, that's these guys. It's guys who are pissed that they can't call things gay anymore. So this is in the Joe Rogan kind of, lane. They're libertarian, so hence the orange here, but also maybe you might say more libertine. So they don't want anyone telling them what to do or what to say. Very anti-PC, very anti-woke, very anti-progressive, but they also reject Christian moralism. So they want all, legalization of drugs and porn and gambling and all that. So all these groups I've just mentioned, per, Ross Douthat's tweet I shared, they're all non-Christian or post-Christian. Though the Q-Anon movement has some overlap with charismatic and some forms of evangelical Christianity. So that's our sort of first set of the new kind of tribes. So let's move into the religious sort of aspects. So the first is Christian nationalism. It's probably one that, some of us are more familiar with. And it's been, I think, getting a lot more attention over the last several months. Some of you may have seen some recent headlines. So in Oklahoma, the school superintendent saying public schools must teach the Bible. In Louisiana, the display of, the 10 Commandments in every classroom. In Indiana, the Republican governor who's running for re-election, he was basically forced by the state party delegation to appoint a running mate who's a Christian nationalist, who wrote that, quote, the day after January 6th, he said God had told him, Micah, I sent those riots to Washington. What you saw yesterday was my hand at work. And if you are interested in some background reading on this, this is a text I found very informative on sort of the history and origins of Christian nationalism. So that's that one. Moving on is the Benedict Option. So this is a phrase coined by the conservative writer Rod Dreher. he is drawing here on the Benedictine monasteries of the Middle Ages from Saint Benedict, the rule of Saint Benedict. And he's using this metaphor to talk about this need to withdraw from what he sees as a basically pagan culture. So it's a reading of modernity as this kind of new dark ages that is hopelessly corrupt and doomed to fail, and something that, serious Christians should not participate in at all. And you might be asking, well, why is there some green in there? Dreher wrote a book called The Crunchy Cons that kind of frames this way of life in countercultural terms. So, it's has this kind of back to the land thing, let's start our own intentional communities and grow our own food and, homeschool our children and make our own clothes. So there's like a hippie element to it, but it's married to traditional cultures. This is really interesting kind of development in the culture. And it's what you might call a kind of transgressive traditionalism. And this is, I think, a really important thing to see, is that elements of the right, of the traditionalist right, have absorbed aspects of the progressive counterculture. And so there are all these interesting mashups that are emerging. So I read this as a kind of fundamentally postmodern phenomenon that thinks it is rebelling against modernity and postmodernity, but actually is kind of unconsciously part of them. And I'll come back to that aspect in a little bit. One thing I want to pause here and point out is that none of the tribes I just discussed have any firm allegiance to liberal democracy. One of the common things that you may have encountered in some of the political rhetoric nowadays, when people question folks on the right about, well, what about democracy this, democracy that? And they say, we don't live in a democracy. We live in a republic. Now, of course, the reply to that is, well, we live in a democratic republic. It's not sort of black and white, but it's a telling rhetorical turn of phrase that I think we should be mindful of and honestly concerned about. Moving on. The Claremont Consensus. So this is a move, I would say, vertically from an intellectual standpoint. These are more educated and sort of philosophically sophisticated folks. The Claremont Institute is a conservative think tank in Northern California. It started to come onto the cultural radar because they were early supporters of Trump's candidacy in 2016. So these figures are, it's Charles Kessler on the top left. Below him is John Eastman, who's the lawyer who was indicted and is facing potential disbarment over his involvement in Trump's attempt to overturn the election in 2020. And on the right is Michael Anton. He was a staffer in the Trump administration. He wrote a piece that became famous in 2016 called The Flight 93 Election. And here's sort of the headline quote from that. He writes, 2016 is the Flight 93 election. Charge the cockpit or you die. You may die anyway. You, or the leader of your party, may make it into the cockpit and not know how to fly or land a plane. There are no guarantees, except one. If you don't try, death is certain. So why? What is their kind of philosophy? Here's what Charles Kessler described it as. He says, we would happily trade our current government for one that worked exactly as designed in 1787, as amended in 1865, and shortly thereafter. And he means the civil rights movement there, and the Civil Rights Act, and so on. So they believe in limited government, the Constitution, the post-Civil War amendments, and the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. That's it. Everything else is tyranny. One thing you will hear folks in this camp frequently talk about is what they call the fourth branch of government, or the administrative state. So they see the federal bureaucracy, federal agencies, as a authoritarian, illegitimate, oppressive form of government. So when Steve Bannon talks about, we're going to deconstruct the administrative state, that's what he's talking about. I think you could probably you could probably put Bannon in this camp, though he has some even more extreme views than some of these folks. So they see the New Deal as a kind of wrong turn in history. And this is really important to get, because this is largely what the Project 2025 stuff that's now getting more attention in the media, this is what it's about. They really do, right or wrong, they really do think it was kind of a wrong turn in American political history. And that's one reason that they really glommed on to Trump, was they saw him turn the clock back to the Republican Party platform of the 1920s. On immigration, very restrictionist. On trade, protectionist. On foreign policy, isolationist. These were all staples of the old Republican Party before the New Deal. So that's a lot of, you might say, the ideological infrastructure of the Trump movement. And one more camp. This is the Techno-Accelerationists. So hyper orange. We've got Elon. We've got Mark Andreessen, who recently published the Techno-Optimist Manifesto. If you want like a diamond hard distillation of hyper orange, it's really good reading. And of course, Peter Thiel. I could give a whole talk about Peter Thiel, but I won't. But one of the fascinating books I read this summer was called The Contrarian. It's a biography of Thiel. He bankrolled the campaigns of Ted Cruz, partly Josh Hawley, Blake Masters, and most importantly, the man who I predict Trump will select as the VP, J.D. Vance. He's got a lot of influence and reach in American politics and the economy. And one other spiral dynamics equation I want to pull out here is orange destroys blue. Orange destroys blue. So one logic of the framework is each new stage tends to attack the stage that came before it, in some cases for good, in some cases for ill. And John Adams had a quote that I quite love. He wrote, "The merchant has no country. The merchant has no country." Edmund Burke, who's one of the seminal philosophers of the conservative movement, a lot of people don't know, actually criticized market civilization as what he called the age of sophisters, economists, and calculators. So there's sort of a type of educated statesman, 19th century gentleman scholar who was suspicious of the excesses of unchecked capitalism, unbridled wild, wild west markets that they saw as incompatible with conservatism, with settled ways of life and traditions. Daniel Bell called this decades ago the cultural contradictions of capitalism. It tends to breed virtues and ways of life that undermine traditional settled ways of life, which are the foundations that allow free enterprise to function. So what I see with this camp is the dangers of libertarianism. It's hostile to traditionalism. What I think held them together during the Reagan years was a long-term common enemy, Soviet communism, and a charismatic leader, Ronald Reagan. What we call neoliberalism today, I think, had a world historical mission that was good, to defeat communism. But by the early 90s, that mission was accomplished. So it had to find a new enemy. And what animates the techno-accelerationists, and I would argue all of these groups, is their hostility to what Elon famously called the woke mind virus. And you might notice in this little doodle I have, I should say I've never had more fun with an Apple Pencil than making this presentation, is these little squiggles of blue and red and purple, is that a lot of what gets called woke is not really coming from a green perspective. It's people using green language and concepts and rhetoric, but coming from a blue or red or purple altitude developmentally. And so that means that Elon has a point. there is something authoritarian and oppressive and regressive about a lot of what gets called woke. The problem is that they tend to conflate that with the totality of progressivism. So that's what I think animates a lot of the new right, is really hostility to the increased space that green is taking up in the culture. So that's all what I regard as the new right, the post-Trump right. There's two more camps, and I know this is a lot, but I want to try and give a full canvas here. There's the never-Trumpers. So these are the old guard. They are still trying to stand up for what's left of the new right. I'm sorry, the old right. So the fusionism of free market orange and traditionalist blue. So this is George Will, Jonah Goldberg, David Frum, Bill Kristol, Scarborough, etc. They're sort of holding the line, what they see as holding the line against Trumpism. And there's one more figure that I want to highlight and high five, because I see this as the healthy green shoot in a future post-Trump healthy Republican Party. And this is what I have, this is my own coinage, is the Prudent Populists. The Prudent Populists. So this is a guy named Orrin Cass. He was a young advisor on Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign. This is his book. And some of you may have read a piece he just wrote, long piece in the Times. It was great. I'd really encourage everybody to read it. I forget the title off the top of my head. I'll just read a couple quotes from it. He says, quote, while policy initiatives from the old libertarian Republican Party often seek to maximize efficiency and growth, move people to opportunity, and redistribute from the economy's winners to the losers, orange, that is orange policies, the typical American has an attachment to place, a focus on family, a commitment to making things, and would accept economic trade-offs in pursuit of those priorities, which is more traditional. He says, look toward the horizon, to the next generation of conservatives poised to lead the post-Trump Republican Party, and the signs of a possible sea change are visible. A cadre of young senators led by Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, Josh Hawley, and Tom Cotton have released a flood of proposals for reshaping global trade and confronting China, rebuilding domestic manufacturing, removing environmental constraints on industrial development, enforcing immigration law, and reducing the flow of low-wage workers into the country, discouraging mergers and tax ends, on and on and on. The point, you can see it illustrated in my colors here, is that there's a really thick, strong, traditional base. That's the foundation, with free enterprise, but also some acknowledgement that, hey, climate change is a problem. And it's not just, a conspiracy theory on the left to destroy capitalism. So keep an eye on him. That's all I'll say about that. So to wrap up, I want to point to something that Steve highlights in his book, Developmental Politics. I'm sure most of you have read it. So you can see here, he lays out the four sort of major worldviews of progressivism, caring values, sort of center-left politics, fairness values, and so on. The pathology that each has in common is cultural bias and tribalism. And I think that's where we're at. Each worldview has, you might say, temporarily regressed into red. The other thing I've highlighted here is under caring values, the progressive left, you see authoritarian demands and self-righteous scolding. And then over on heritage values, a pathology is oppressive authoritarianism. So this is what each side is reacting to, what they perceive as authoritarian plays for power from the other side. And both of them have a point. So that's part of what we're all marinating in. I'm going to skip over this guy, Patrick Deneen, and just point out that I think the problem is we're all seeing red right now. Traditionalists feel like they are surrounded. This is why they talk about religious liberty so much. Orange folks concerned for free speech, they see hostile people attacking them, trying to deplatform them, cancel them. And green, sees red everywhere. It thinks in terms of power, oppressors versus oppressed. So that's part of the problem. As I was trying to think about this from a spiralist perspective, what occurred to me was that we talk a lot about development and this movement up, developing beyond. But just as important is development down, or envelopment. And I've come to see blue traditionalism as, you might say, the collective heart chakra of society. It's what binds the whole thing together. As Ken Wilber put it, so civilization is the taming of testosterone, or red. That's what it has to do. But it also has to be a sturdy foundation for what we build on beyond that. So I'll conclude with a few points. To summarize, the key to healing our politics is anticipating the future of the past. The conservative bloc in American politics today is the right wing of the Democratic Party and Mitt Romney and a few other people. But neither party is performing what you might call the essential conservative function. That's why everything feels so unstable and in such disarray. To be conservative today, I think, is to preserve and balance all three great traditions in American political culture. There's a mistake of seeing traditionalism as the only tradition. But at this point, liberalism, and I think even progressive postmodernism, they are established ways of thinking and institutions and so on, and they're not going to go away. And to try and eradicate them, as many folks on the right want to, is actually going to cause more chaos than it would be to try and find a way to find détente with them. And in my view, what I want to call Volkism is more dangerous than wokeism. The ethnocentric flaring of the right I see as a more dangerous threat to liberal democracy than wokeism. To stabilize orange democracy, we need to regrow blue traditionalism. That's the foundation that it grows out of and that makes it possible. I'm a lower right quadrant guy. I think the systems are what drive stuff. It's the internet and the infrastructure, stupid. 40 years of neoliberal, what I would call mean orange economics, have eroded the material infrastructure that makes healthy blue communities and civil society possible. And the best thing that the Biden administration has done is the infrastructure trifecta of the Inflation Reduction Act, the Chips and Science Act, and the infrastructure package. And no one will benefit more from that in the middle term than Trump country. Economic and cultural forces have conspired to produce at scale a psychograph akin to what Wilber identified in the many faces of terrorism, blue beliefs with a red sense of self. That's the, you might say, the most dangerous critical acupuncture point, is the line between red and blue. You've got to seal off the portal to red, to the red underworld, as it were. Nothing gets fixed if that is not somehow driven out of politics. And finally, stop talking about transgenderism and systemic racism. It just has to stop. There's nothing more alarming and aggravating to the right. Just it can't be a part of a healthy politics going forward. David Frum wrote, if liberals do not police their borders, fascists will do it for them. Sustained industrial policy, rebuilding the heartland, or what Ezra Klein calls a liberalism that builds. Social policy to drive household formation and family formation, and marry progressive economics to Christian morality. There's resources for this in our history, the social gospel, and Catholic social teaching. So draw from what the traditions offer for an economics focused on the least of these. And my last point is, I think that the integral conservative politician of the future, the person most likely to be that, is not likely to be a Republican. It's likely to be a Democrat, and it's likely to be Pete Buttigieg. And God, do I wish that he would buck the tide and say, fuck it, and just run. I'll leave it there.
Oh, great.
Sorry, I went over a little bit.
No, that you went just right. All right. So, um, what's bubbling up? Do you have any questions, any disagreements, any thoughts? Just click the react button with the little the heart shape down at the bottom of the screen and then raise hand. All right, we're going to start with Barbara Brown and then Steve. Go for it, Barbara.
Um, Question: all of the corruption that we're seeing in politics, and not just in Washington, I see it in our local county even. Do you consider that just sick orange, or is it red? I mean, it's very much corporate.
Mm. So the question is about corruption in politics, and from a meme,
Citizens United on steroids.
yeah. I mean, I think that's fair. One of the things I commonly come back to is Michael Douglas's character from Wall Street, Gordon Gekko. Greed is good. I see that as a really good distillation of, I guess you might say, the psychograph of unhealthy orange, no blue morals, that allows for red greed to kind of come up. So I don't think capitalism is inherently greedy. I don't think money in politics is necessarily bad. Frankly, I don't think it's avoidable. Would be naive to think that. But yeah, I think that's fair to say. Yeah, undue muddied interests, orange interests in politics that lead to that. Yeah, that sounds right to me.
Cool. All right, Steve, Carter, and then Michael. Go for it, Steve.
Hey, so David, that was really truly excellent. I really learned some things from that typology, and very excellent food for thought. So my question is really goes to the heart of your conclusion, which is rebuilding blue. And while we'd like to think of blue in a more inclusive way that includes all the world's great religious traditions, and then that's certainly the way I like to think of blue in its most healthy expression, something like the Parliament of World Religions or something like that, where there's a kind of a green overlay of inclusivity and pluralism. But within Western civilization, notwithstanding those inclusive sensibilities, we still have Christianity as the foundational blue for the Western world. At least, that's the historical, that history is there strongly. And in your typology of the right, you include, for example, Jerry Falwell, right? And some of the types were very much majority blue in a strong way. I'm interested in just probing a little bit more on your thoughts in terms of how we can rebuild blue. I mean, not just with emphasizing family formation and kind of mining the social gospels for green friendly ideas. I think those are two excellent suggestions. But the thing that comes to my mind is the intense aversion that so many elite Americans, both orange and green, are have toward Christianity, right? It's loathsome, right? So, for example, Christian nationalism is a huge boogeyman in the elite media. And then when you look at it, you say, well, that's the kind of ideology that America had for its first 200 years. And that doesn't mean that it's not threatening or there's not problems with it. But the idea that it has become so repulsive, I think, just kind of getting at the elements of blue that could be, revived and revalorized.
Yeah.
I'm just interested in if you have any further thoughts about how we might go about that in a conscious cultural way.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll say two things. The first is, and I started to gesture toward it a little bit toward the end, is that the way I see it is that if you have relatively good economic conditions and a reason for, optimism for your family and your children, then blue is going to get less defensively, absolutistically ethnocentric. what I see is a longer term strategy, and this is part of the problem, that to fix the problem, you can't do it in an election cycle or a quarter or even probably 5 years. You need sort of a generation, because you have to rebuild the heartland. You have to rebuild what I like to think of as the economic foundation that allows healthy communities to build up. It's sort of like cultural topsoil. The cultural topsoil has been eroded, and people feel raw about it. I think it's part of the rage that comes out at Trump rallies and sort of from that part of the culture. And so you've got to restore a baseline level of economic security. It might even be beige in the spiral terms, so that people don't feel like they're under economic threat and cultural threat. So this is the aspect of, green's got to cool it, as it were, with a lot of the quote unquote woke stuff. It does, because cultural threat from above, as it were, and economic threat from below, that's what I think turns blue hostile and wanting to attack orange and drag it down to sort of a lower level. So that's one part of it. That's why I think industrial policy is the solution, because neoliberalism eroded the foundation of healthy blue cultures, the material foundations of it. And progressive culture sort of poured acid on the wound, you might say, from a values perspective. I had a second thought, but I can't remember it. So
No, that was great.
See if it comes back to me.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Carter, and then Michael.
Hi, David. Thanks
Hey,
so
Carter.
much for that. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed the classification of the various forms, and I appreciate your insights. A quick question. I appreciate that you brought Warren Cass in, because I do think he's an important figure. Matt Stoller is the Warren Cass of the left. If you know Matt,
Yeah.
he's a very important figure on the left as well. I mean, he's basically doing the same thing on the left. So, and they're actually allies in certain ways. So, I just think, I think as the party, as the right sort of searches for itself in whatever becomes a post-Trump world, inevitably there'll be figures arise that sort of combine elements of the different elements that you shared, right? I'm just curious, and I think Cass might be part of that. I'm just curious if you have any sense of what's emerging, like what often when like a Reagan-esque figure emerges, it's both the force of their personality, but it's the alliance of different combinations of those various forces on any given political side that makes that a powerful political sort of synthesis. Do you have any sense of what elements of all those you listed are the most powerful at forming the synthesis that is going to emerge in the next 15 years? Do you have any thoughts about that as you studied it?
Oof. That's tough.
Sure, it is. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, Rigel promised I would give all the answers. So at the beginning. I mean, a very quick, rough stab at it is the populist pincer in 2016 from Bernie on the left and Trump on the right was a signal, inchoate, but a powerful signal of where the system has to go. And I think that the fusion, a new fusion could be, I gestured toward the end about Ezra Klein's point of a liberalism that builds. He's really on the way in which progressives, because of their preoccupation with the precautionary principle and environmental safety reviews and all these kinds of things, have gotten in the way of liberal goals of building, especially around green infrastructure and clean energy.
Yes.
That, I see Klein's views there as a good step in the direction because it's a focus on building stuff. So I think a big opportunity is, I don't want to say a war on big tech, but parlaying the tech lash into constructive policy proposals to build stuff in the world of its as opposed to the world of bits. The culture is really screaming out against how Silicon Valley's moved too fast and broken too many things. And I think that there's a real opportunity for collaboration from a younger group of thinkers and policymakers to focus on, I mean, to riff on Whitmer's point, fix the damn roads. That kind of rhetoric and that kind of energy is, hey, like, our goal is not basis on Mars. Our goal is the average family being able to own a home, educate their children on one salary if they so choose, and like kind of be able to live a decent life. Like that's the mundane goal that I think both parties should focus on, and there's shoots of that starting to happen. So big question, but that's some rough thoughts.
Right. Cool. Thank you. I appreciate it all.
Yeah.
Great. We've got several people with their hands raised, so just try to keep your questions concise, okay? Michael Grady, and then Michael Abramson. So Michael Grady, you go first.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, David. What an interesting thought, food for thought, as Steve said, is I was unfamiliar with the Barstool Cons, Claremont Consensus, and kind of laying this out of what's out there, what's the possibility, what's the possible threats here. And I think a lot obviously hinges on whether Trump wins or not. I mean, if somehow we survive that, and then some people start regrouping. But a couple of things are, I think broadly speaking, there's just this narrative of who's more authoritative and controlling in our society, the left or the right. And if I feel controlled in this authoritative policing of my language around who's who and what's a man and what's not a man, I'm going to feel this sense of we need somebody to fight back against that. And I think that's what he tapped into. And on the left, now I think it's kind of getting tamped down. But just that notion of what is this authoritative state? And I think, as you say, what you're alluding to is that they're willing to take this all the way down. We're going to go back to some very simple principles. There's one authority, God. There's one authority, the president. There's one authority, this Christian tradition. And because it's so complex and confusing and seems out of control to people.
Yeah.
And the question, I like Bill Maher's, I feel like a 90s liberal. Like I was a liberal in the 90s, and all this stuff has just left me. And the same thing with Musk. Musk said the Democratic Party left him. And the question is, how do you feel about what if Trump does lose? What are your thoughts on that at this point?
Oh shit!
And review
that wasn't that wasn't the question I was expecting, but I'll bite.
Uh-huh.
Well, I think that either way, whether he loses or doesn't, I don't want to quite say there will be blood, but I think it's very important to keep in mind the number of people that firmly believe that the election was stolen in 2020.
Well, I'm sorry, David. I don't mean that issue. I mean, like all of these ideas are rising, these views.
Yeah.
Do you think they'll flourish more, or that they kind of fade with Trump as the leader?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I do think that the good news is that he's a charismatic leader. So I don't think that, according to Max Weber's definition, charismatic movements do not outlast the death of the leader or the virtual death of the leader. So I think that that's good. Of course, the energies that he summoned are not going to completely evaporate, but it's hard to believe anybody will be able to command and organize and mobilize those forces to the extent that he did in political life. But I mean, there's the short-term question of, what happens logistically in terms of what will his supporters do if he loses in terms of civil strife and violence and whatnot. But longer term, I think that my hope is it could force the Republican Party to, as it were, transcend the unhealthy aspects of Trumpism and preserve and carry forward the healthy aspects, because I think it needs to be acknowledged. He put his finger on important points in the culture, energies that needed to be released,
Right.
and shifted the conversation more toward populism, more toward a focus on workers, even though he didn't actually do that when he was president through his policies. At least it shifted the conversation in that direction. And there are signs of some folks. I don't think J.D. Vance is a good faith actor. I hope he is. I don't think he is, but I hope he is. And I hope he's able to parlay his influence into constructive proposals along the lines of what Vance said. But it's difficult to do that. To your question about authoritarianism, it's difficult to do that politically without playing these notes on the spiral, lower down, below orange. So that's a tricky thing. But I think if you do take Trump out of the equation, it dials the temperature down to create some space for maneuvering, for parlaying the good parts of Trumpism, possibly, per the previous question, in collaboration with more enlightened Democrats.
Yeah. And Vance was anti-Trump before he was pro-Trump, right?
He was.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Michael. I want to get on to the next questions here. All right, David, go ahead.
Thanks, Roger. Appreciate it. David, great presentation. I appreciated the graphics and the colors. I'm a visual learner, so it's always helpful to see how you have your colors stacked up there. Where I'm curious to hear your thoughts unpacked a little bit more thoroughly would be how and where you see a role for classical liberalism, or what I call Orange 101, to take a more prominent role in some of these conversations, given that where Wilbur and Beck and Cohen and a lot of the other developmentalists agree is that the biggest virtue of Orange 101 coming in was it uniting and bringing forth the common humanity that was sort of invisible in the blue on blue Protestant, Catholic, German, French, us, them dynamics that were prevalent all over the place, and having that orange emergence of a recognition of the sovereign individual, which leads to the rule of law, the scientific method, the relevance of universal human rights, democratic processes, et cetera. Given that orange seems to unite people and pull them out of blue, where do you see Orange 101 or classical liberalism having a place in your prescription for moving forward here?
Yeah. So my answer may sound a little counterintuitive, but I think in terms of a constructive policy proposal, one of the best things to strengthen that sense of orange identity, if you like, is a national service program. And it's Buttigieg proposed it when he was running. A number of folks on the right, including Vivek Ramaswamy, proposed it in his campaign. So it's both an idea that I think would get very strong bipartisan support. And I think it's good because it would because this is the sneaky thing, is that you have to learn orange. You have to develop orange. And orange has symbols and rituals, and it needs to be ritualized. Let me put it that way. And a national service program would be a great way to do that. So if you, grow up in inner city Boston, go spend a summer, building houses the cliche thing, build houses in Alabama, vice versa, right? So instead of study abroad, study near. So cultivate a sense of both national belonging, but also what does it mean to belong to the nation, to recognize and act as, this individual with these rights and recognize other people's that. So that's one thing I would see as what I would call a more healthy kind of form of conservative inculcation in classical liberal values, which many conservatives understand themselves as classical liberals. So I could say more, but yeah, that's one idea.
Great.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And just real quick comment, follow up. Albert Murray's Omni American, I believe, would be a good sort of component of that recipe where the previous to what's happening next identity can be more widely shared and create that common background there. Thank you. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, David. All right, Matt, and then Stephanie.
Thanks, David, so much. I really appreciated this idea that of rebuilding the blue infrastructure. That's not something I've really thought about. And my question is kind of a follow-up to Steve's question, I think. One of the things that's been really formative of my thinking about what's happening now is an essay by Sir John Glubb from the 70s called The Fate of Empires, which I highly recommend to anybody who hasn't read it. Glubb's thesis was basically that he studied about a couple dozen empire-level civilizations, and he said that ascendant civilizations tend to front virtue. Virtue leads to affluence.
Worthy and fixes your bad photo.
Affluence leads to a shift away from pursuit of virtue to pursuit of affluence as the primary focus, and then that puts a civilization into typically irreversible decline. And my sense has been that that we're past peak, and that when we're talking about we could be talking about America this past peak, but because of the transmission of cultural memes, that it's possible the West is in what for Glubb would be a past peak cycle in that regard, and that one of the things we may be able to do is wake up and kind of do psychotherapy on a civilization and transform it. But it's left me really skeptical that institutions are going to be the infrastructure that does the transformation, because I'm skeptical that institutions have the ability to anticipate and respond to the deeper underlying forces here. And I'm really encouraged by more kind of house church grassroots type things like the organization Braver Angels, which is trying to build social fabric at the super grassroots and doing really powerful work. And I've thought that like thoughtful microcultures that are creating sort of self-verifying new culture that cross-pollinate might be actually the infrastructure that is we're looking for. You know, like the first century church, second century church is kind of a model, I think, of what we're actually trying to achieve. So I guess my question to you is, do you see these changes happening through traditional institutional infrastructures? And do you, apart from that, do you see some of these promising developing microcultures in like integral movements and just in folks who are sort of aware of these things? Do you see anything that suggests that that kind of change can be leveraged through some mechanism?
Yeah, fantastic question. So yeah, I am not, I mean, the answer is yes, because because of human freedom and agency. The antidote to doomerism is that people act. People are resilient. And I want to just very quickly zoom out and say that this way of thinking, I think, is important because the sort of declinism, historian Niall Ferguson is pushing this. Bannon believes a version of this with his fourth turning thesis, and the sequence you mentioned, the parallel theme is, hard times make strong men bring good times make soft men bring bad times, etc. So, I think there's clearly something to that. Peter Turchin wrote a book called End Times. He studied the collapse of civilizations, and he said there's two features that mark them. One is the overproduction of elites who don't have a place in society and feel disaffected and then start to attack the society. And prolonged immiseration is the second one. Part of the problem right now is, and this is true for Europe and the US, we're actually not immiserated. there's a very big, strong cultural narrative around how bad the economy is and whatnot. But if America, repeals itself as a democratic republic and so on, it'll be the first one to do so with full unemployment and rising wages. So to that point, I think what's different now and what's dangerous is not actually the material conditions, it's the cultural conditions brought on by the material condition of the internet. I think that's what's new. I think a lot of it is so downstream of technology and what it's doing to our brains and what it's making us believe misguidedly about institutions. I actually don't think that the institutions are as corrupt and incompetent as people generally think. Have mistakes been made? Yes, and more than mistakes. But there's a narrative out there of pessimism around institutions that I think is just not true. And the best text on this for me is Michael Lewis's book, The Fifth Risk. It's sort of a hymn to the deep state, as one of the blurbs says. All the unsung heroes in the civil service who do their job and don't get paid that well, but they do it and they believe in the mission. And if anything, it's skepticism about institutions that could lead to actual system failure. And that's the view, I think, of the Trumpists, is they think everyone's like them. And if you believe otherwise, you're a sucker. So I could say a lot more about that. But yeah, I think microcultures are happening at all levels of memes. And whether it's Braver Angels, whether it's Benedict Options, whether it's, communes, and so on. So those are necessary but not sufficient. You need big, aggressive national policy to move the infrastructure in the place it needs to go for the culture to get to the place it needs to. So, yeah.
Thanks, Matt. All right, let's see if we can get one more question in real quick. Stephanie, go for it.
Okay, thanks. And my internet's not great, so I'm going to keep it on this volume and I'll try to be short. But I was really struck by your comment about the crunchy cons and the not being connected to liberalism. And I guess I wondered, my question is if you have a specific thought about a group of people that I see who are always going to be voting right in this moment, who are pretty liberal, I think, but who come from places I'm from Eastern Colorado, Texas, maybe upstate New York. These are people who are living and have lived rurally, but are relatively liberal, but are seeing their way of life sort of being overrun by progressives moving into all of these places and buying all of the real estate and changing all of the policy. And I guess kind of threatening I think the crunchy cons are a little more libertarian. And I think there's a subsection of people who probably appear like a crunchy con, but aren't actually that libertarian. They're just people who are sort of liberal or maybe a little more conservative, probably more moderate, but will vote against progressivism because progressivism actually seeks to change their way of life, whereas voting conservative or voting for the right is more likely to keep the status quo. Does that make sense? I'm thinking of a Texas voter. I'm thinking of a rural Colorado voter.
Yeah. Oh, what a great question. What a great question.
So they're not really in your categories, right?
Yeah. You got to come up with a new category.
I know a lot of people like that, so that's why.
Yeah.
And they feel homeless. That's the other thing. There's nowhere for them to go because their homes are being bought up.
So two things I'll say is I want to make a distinction between progressive wealthy people who might go in and buy up real estate. And people who are doing that may be progressive, they may not be. That's different from the Democratic Party being in control and crafting policy. So whether or not changes to rural ways of living driven by progressives buying up real estate is downstream of actual Democratic Party policy, right? That's one question. That's an empirical question. I don't know the answer to that. The second is about sort of changing ways of life. And one thing I want to point to, I don't know whether it applies exactly to this case, but I was reading this article about a village in northern France before the left outfoxed the political right in the elections on Sunday. And it was about how, Macron, center left, had, funded this battery plant and was bringing up all these jobs to this place that had been devastated because the jobs had left decades ago because of neoliberal capitalism. And they're afraid of crime and they're afraid of immigration. And they're pissed off that the jobs aren't what they used to. And so they're going to vote for the right. But crime is not up in their village. And immigrants are not flooding their communities and sort of altering their way of life. They're seeing that on the news about what's happening in Paris and the cities. And the problem is that the long-term solution that the Macrons are trying to fund of building stuff in the heartland is the best thing to help fix the culture there and help restore the way of life. So I think there's sort of a funhouse mirror quality to the optics of this that often happens. I could say a lot more, but those are just some beginning thoughts.
Okay, no, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's it, folks. This has been a fantastic conversation. I feel like we're just getting the juices going, but this will be recorded and uploaded. So please, let's continue the conversation, continue the questions, and riffing on this topic. David.